Good afternoon, everyone. As you all very well know, of course, the CEC17 comes at a very critical juncture, an appropriate point in time to be discussing climate measures in general, following on the Paris Agreement of 2015, which I'm sure I don't need to tell you much about, or its 2-degree limits, or its goal to try to keep temperature even under global temperature increase even under 1.5 degrees. In the broader context, in the same year, the United Nations, of course, passed its Sustainable Development Goals. Further context that you might not know about are several activities that have been going on, including the intensification of research with the first Gordon Research Conference that has been conducted on climate engineering, which David Keith was one of the chairs of, and took place this summer, along with the development of several research programs and several engagement programs, such as the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, the C2G2, the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative and its expansion, which was just announced this morning, the SRMGI, the new Harvard program, which David Keith announced this morning, and several others. So we've also described yesterday evening and this morning, and you probably have read and know well, that it would be very difficult to achieve the Paris Agreement goals without some form of climate engineering. It's not impossible, but societally it would be extremely challenging to develop the kind of support that would be needed for making the changes in our infrastructures, in our energy systems, our mobility, and to a great extent in our lifestyles in order to pull that off in the timescales needed without some form of going beyond mitigation. That difficulty is reflected in something that perhaps some of you don't realize, which is that the scenarios that the IPCC, in German the Weltklimarat, that they used for the last assessment report in 2013, nearly all contained some form of carbon dioxide removal in extensive amounts in order to stay below 2 degrees. The high ambition scenarios, nearly over 90% of those, had assumed that several hundred gigatons of carbon dioxide would be taken out of the atmosphere by some mechanism, particularly assuming it would be bioenergy combined with carbon capture and sequestration by the end of the century. So this is really challenging, that this is hardly known outside of those who really deal with the topic. And the methods that are being discussed for this have only begun to be tested or implemented. More about the issue of carbon dioxide removal you can gladly read in the fact sheet that we've put together, especially as information timely for this conference. Given the challenges of the possibilities of achieving the Paris Agreement goals through mitigation and even through the application of these very uncertain carbon dioxide removal mechanisms, it's not surprising that the discussion of further techniques, of solar radiation management techniques, is likely to grow. We also have published a fact sheet on this. You'll be hearing more from David Keith specifically about that. And you'll notice that we put this in 2 separate fact sheets, but we have this together at one conference. And would like to emphasize that these 2 topics in and of themselves, in many ways, are very distinct, but in some cases, it's useful to bring them together. I see that very much like the issues around air pollution and climate change, which are distinct, but in the coalition, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, for instance, we bring these topics together because there are forums where it's useful to talk about them together at the same time. So it's obvious that we need an extensive dialogue around these topics. And the CEC17 is intended to provide a forum for exactly the critical, global, transparent discussions that we need around research, regulation, and the assessment of the arguments that are both in favor of and against research and large-scale technical interventions in the climate system. We've brought together different scientific disciplines, as well as bringing together representatives from various walks of society, from politics to civil society to religious groups and further. The CEC17 builds on the successes that we had at the CEC14, which took place just over 3 years ago, also here in Berlin. But of course, the framework has changed somewhat since then, as I mentioned at the beginning. In the CEC17, we'll have a total of 4 days with 32 sessions, unfortunately running in parallel sometimes, so those who are interested in many things have to choose, and 6 plenary discussions. This time we focused more on encouraging the conveners to make use of understanding about exchange and dialogue in interactive formats, such as campfire sessions and fishbowl sessions, and even games, which Pablo Suarez, for instance, is bringing in to us, which he had already brought in the CEC14 as well. We have a very active participation from NGOs. You'll be hearing more from Lili Fuhr about that, and has also just conducted a very interesting discussion about the radical emissions reductions that are being encouraged by some of the NGOs. We also have a greater participation from developing and newly industrialized countries, which is especially thanks to our partnership with the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative, the SRMGI. I'd like to mention a couple of the highlights for you if you're staying on for the next hours, for the next days, excuse me. In the next hours, in the next session or the next set of sessions, there will be a session on religions and climate engineering. Later on, we'll be hearing of a session that's especially interesting for journalists, I think, the current political focus in a session called Trumped, A New Politics of Climate Engineering, ? David Keith will be running a session on the solar radiation management experiments, which have been proposed, and is also involved in a session on the climate engineering research, starting and stopping rules. And we have a session towards the end on the potential for development of a code of conduct for geoengineering research. And finally, I'd like to mention that our approach to this fits very well in with the work of the IASS, which is especially in the context of us serving as a platform to actively bring together the wide ranges of forms of knowledge to bring out the dialogue that's needed, to focus on the basic research that is needed, and as a quick mention, our research is shifting from the very broad research we've done in the past towards a more intense focus on the development of governance, both near-term and long-term governance of climate engineering, which is being led by Stefan Schaefer, who is probably here in the audience, and if you'd like to know more about the specific research we're working on the topic, then you're very welcome to talk with him. Finally, I'll mention, if there is anything that you specifically would like to know about, approach any of us. We know most of the community, and if we're not the right person for you to speak to, we'll be glad to point you to the right person, and like to make sure that there are voices all around here being heard. Thank you.
I'd like to make the case that it really makes sense. Sure. I'd like to make the case for a broad research program on solar geoengineering, a research program that is international, that's open access, a research program that serves the needs and is determined substantially by some of the people, the poorest people in the world, who will suffer climate damages most strongly. I want to argue that there is no way to conclude that solar geoengineering is necessary, that statements that we need to do it in order to meet Paris are a rhetorical trick, and I'll say more about what I mean by that. And finally, I want to make the case for research in the full knowledge that research will be misused, that with a broad effort of research on solar geoengineering, I expect to see, and we have some evidence already, that forces that oppose action on mitigation, for example, some of the big oil companies or petrostates, may deliberately exploit this research to argue falsely against the need to cut emissions. So let me say a little bit more about, what I mean. Let me say a little bit more about why I think we cannot conclude that it is necessary to cut emissions. Sorry. I'm trying to get notes that I had that were good, and I can't find them now. In opening the conference, Mark Lawrence said that it was technically possible to stay under 1.5 with emissions cuts. And I think that hides a crucial kind of technocratic caveat, which is that the analysis actually says that we can cut emissions quickly enough that we can have, say, a better than even odds of keeping under 1.5 or some other numerical threshold. But that's a very different statement than saying that we can definitely do it. What that says is that if we cut emissions even instantaneously, if we eliminate emissions today, there would still be some chance that temperatures actually would go over, say, 1.5 or even over 2, a small chance. What we can say is that cutting emissions in a defined way increases the odds of a good outcome, which is why we need to cut emissions. And the more quickly we cut emissions, the more likely we are to have a good outcome. But it is very tempting to say something that seems kind of objective, which is to say that there's some sharp threshold that if we cut emissions enough, some defined enough, we can stay underneath that threshold, and therefore we do not need to do climate engineering. I believe that that statement confuses the physical reality we live in. And I'd say two key pieces of that physical reality are, first of all, that there is not a sharp objective threshold where climate damage starts. So as much as in the political world we try and talk about dangerous climate change, which means something under the convention, there is no sharp, dangerous climate change. Depending on whether you're a South Indian farmer or an Arctic fox, depending on where you live and who you are, you will have different thresholds where you will feel the real hard effects of climate change. And for some people, for some entities, 1 degree C would be much too much, and for others, 2 degrees C might not be so bad. There's no objective hard number. And second of all, the collective actions by people around the world have the power to reduce emissions. That we collectively can determine how much emissions we have. But that does not determine how much climate change we have, because the risk of climate change grows with the accumulation of emissions. And again, even cutting emissions to zero does not guarantee some outcome with respect to the climate risks. So Lili Fuhr, I believe, will argue that we ought to cut emissions much more quickly, to have radical emissions cuts. I actually agree with that. But it is not correct to conclude, I believe there is no value-free way to conclude from that you should not do geoengineering. Because the fact is, even if we do all the emissions cuts suggested, we might still end up with a world where the sea level rises meters, or we have over 1.5. So I think the conclusion is there's no value-free way out of this.
Okay, thank you. I think I can build nicely on that. So I will speak about what we can do to go beyond our mainstream solutions to radically reduce emission reductions, and also why we think that investing more in geoengineering and geoengineering research is a dangerous idea. I will briefly touch upon the role of civil society, and I was also asked to speak about my expectations for this conference, which I'm happy to do. So we think that in order to live up to the ambitions that governments set with the Paris Agreement, we have to follow what we call radical emission reduction pathways that go far beyond conventional economic thinking. So just two examples of what this could look like, and the list could be much, much longer. I just picked two. So when we talk about phasing out fossil fuels, what usually people then think is we mean phasing out coal and stopping to explore for new oil and gas, maybe getting out of the dirtiest forms of oil and gas production. But what is really necessary is that we begin a managed decline of our entire fossil fuel industry. So we need to close already producing oil and gas fields. And that is a much tougher ask. And the thing is, we've only just begun demanding that of our governments. It's not that civil society has been calling for this for a very long time, but the first thing is to say what is necessary to get anywhere near to it. A second thing I want to highlight is the way we look at waste in our economy. Usually it's considered, yes, a potential to reduce emissions, but then the mainstream solutions only address end-of-pipe solutions. But what about real zero-waste circular economy approaches? Research commissioned by Zero Waste Europe found that an optimal implementation of the EU Commission's circular economy package could save the EU 100 million tons of CO2 per year. That is about the equivalent of the annual emissions of the Netherlands. And we think we can go much further than that. If we seriously think about reducing the overall energy and resource input into our economy, so consume, produce less stuff, that will produce less emissions. And I would also argue that all of that, even all of that, and many more things we can do to mitigate climate change might not be enough. So we have to seriously think about ways to safely and sustainably and in a just manner take carbon out of the atmosphere. We don't call it negative emission technologies. We have something entirely different in mind. We're thinking of ways to protect and carefully restore our global ecosystems, first and foremost our rainforests, moors and oceans. The Stockholm Environment Institute has calculated that we could repay our land carbon debt, so restore our natural ecosystems, and manage the storage of 220 to 330 gigatons of CO2 worldwide as a one-time but very significant contribution. We think that until we've exhausted all of these options, and I've said this list is much longer, there's no need that we talk about geoengineering. It is also actually quite dangerous to do so. The kinds of solutions that are being proposed under the heading of geoengineering are new mega industrial and military complex. They're complex as industries. They're mega industries that are either very energy and resource intensive. That is certainly true for most carbon dioxide removal technologies, and they require entirely new levels of military control and bring new security concerns, and profit mostly those who have brought us into this crisis in the first place. On the role of civil society, unfortunately, current debates about geoengineering are mostly undemocratic, dominated by technocratic worldviews, natural science and engineering perspectives, as well as by vested interests from the fossil fuel industry. Well, the group of people actively pushing against further research into and deployment of these technologies is very small. This should not be, in my view, confused with a lack of silent protest that can easily be mobilized, as we have seen when geoengineering experiments in the past have rid real territories affecting real people and real livelihoods. And we will see more of that. So just very briefly on my expectations for this conference, I think that the time is ripe for this debate to become a much broader one. I think we have to recognize, I'm very grateful to the Institute here that we've brought so many different players at the table, and I hope that we manage to jointly bring and discuss this geoengineering debate, bring the geoengineering debate outside of the climate bubble and have a broader societal debate about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Allow me to start with a disclosure. I lead research and innovation for the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. We are a technical reference center. We follow these discussions, which are still a very new topic for the humanitarian sector. Therefore, I am not, repeat, not speaking on behalf of the IFRC or the German Red Cross or any of the members of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. Thanks for your consideration of that fact. So geoengineering is a humanitarian concern. The potential for deliberate large-scale intervention in the Earth's climate system has major implications in terms of the impacts on the most vulnerable, which is what we care most for. Geoengineering may be perceived as too theoretical, too complex, not imminent enough to merit attention, especially among those who are dealing with disasters and changing conditions so rapidly. However, if we wait for imminence, it will likely become too late by the time we join the conversation. The processes require us, it is imperative to ensure that the humanitarian considerations are integrated into policy decisions. Given the Paris Agreement and the statement of well below 2 degrees, the time may have arrived for scaling up humanitarian engagement in geoengineering. Now, what are we talking about? Science and technology offer to go up high in the atmosphere, to place a veil of magic dust, a light curtain to curtail global warming. We've entered an era of tests that are starting, and indeed, it is irresistible to find where language helps us understand what's going on and how these topics are going to be framed. Solar radiation management is the technical term that has been used. You could label that as dispatching sulfur to the stratosphere to obstruct sunlight and ostensibly save us. Now, my grandmother lived to 106 years of age. Stuff may happen that will surprise us. In our lifetime, in our foreseeable future, one day we may be asked to trust the sulfur dust. We may be asked to act fast. And it is very concerning to imagine that moment, to imagine what may trigger that moment and what we may do at that time. Some of the language in geoengineering publications and discussions reveal, in our opinion, what we're referring to as potentially delusional assumptions of rationality about motivations, incentives, triggers likely to shape decisions and actions. The Nobel Prize was given to a scholar in behavioral economics. We know that there are things we don't fully understand, especially how we will collectively and individually behave. Will the results of deploying geoengineering be worse than the alternative? Will geoengineering be worse than inaction in the face of accelerating global climate change? The answer for now is both. We don't know, and it depends. As disaster managers, it is our duty to consider Murphy's Law. We must anticipate what can go wrong with or without geoengineering, especially for those who lack the means to cope with surprises. Those who can suffer the worst outcomes need to be involved, and there's calls for that, and we celebrate that. This is especially true given the plausibility of predatory geoengineering, where reckless, self-concerned actions may result in harmful consequence to others. Whether unintentionally through emissions or deliberately through geoengineering, altering the Earth's climate is an experiment. We're all in this planet test subjects, and nobody likes to be a rat in someone else's laboratory. At the Red Crescent Climate Center, we have been engaged in these conversations since 2009. We have been proposing the creation of geoengineering risk management framework to anticipate what may happen. What we ask is caution first. We should do all that we can to avoid having to face a geoengineering decision. Fairness, inclusiveness, prevention of the possibility of predatory geoengineering, and in the context of tipping points or runaway climate change scenarios, geoengineering could help reduce impacts on some of the most vulnerable. But global power dynamics are not set up to ensure that the interests of the most vulnerable are elicited, considered, and addressed. Thanks for your attention, and we look forward to good conversations in this event.